Boys and girls, we've got the trio back today for the Rap 31 monumentous realigning of the stars as all three of us are back in the building. How are we doing tonight, Dr. Xanax?
I'm going well, mate. I'm going well. Good to see the return of the Slender Man back from the land of the lost, the Gold Coast, the Sunshine State, and the bastion of all things Christian up there. And I'm keen to hear more stories about Andy and how he gave half the schoolies up there tonsillitis.
Mainly the male population.
We've got jokes today, boys. We're on fire already. So how you doing, DC?
Pretty good. I'm making a conscious effort to speak closer to the mic. Also looking forward to hearing Andy's escapades. I saw there was I think it was 7 or 9 news story that we shared of the someone
50
left 50 nangs on the ground, and we sent Agent Andos around
Used nangs
to see if they can find the
50 used up nangachinos.
To see if you could find the nang culprit. I don't know if he was successful. A nang, for anyone who doesn't know, is a utensil used for baking cakes, but these damn teenagers turned it into a party drug. And these damn nanganators have been plaguing the brains of our young children, these teenagers on the Gold Coast.
A few Margaret Nangers.
From what I've heard, it makes you feel like a real degenerate afterwards. That's from my reporting on the Gold Coast, coming live at you.
No idea who is the nanganator?
Look, there's probably about 95% of the schoolies population that you could find as the nanganator culprits, if I'm honest.
You know, when I was on schoolies, the nangs just weren't a thing.
How times have changed.
Look, I would say with almost all certainty that you could go into any apartment in the Gold Coast during schoolies and find more than 50 nangs. Not in mine, though.
A lot of bustling cake baking industry up on the Gold Coast.
And also balloon blowing industry. A lot of cake baking and balloon blowing.
Yeah, it's funny as well because when someone goes in to buy them, the people have to ask them what you're using it for, and then you have everyone baking cupcakes.
Is that? Do they have to ask you now what you're using it for?
I'm not sure if they have to, but
It'd be a classic government regulation.
But they was doing
inefficient and just making someone look like an absolute idiot.
Yeah, you got these big ballers going in there, getting themselves five cartons.
I'm baking 5 million cupcakes. What for? The YouTube channel.
So yeah, look, we didn't find the nang culprit, but you best think we're on your heels.
We found tens of thousands of them. Okay, Andos, what do we got today?
We got a big news week. We've got the WESTPAC scandal, which I think that's Dr. Zan. Is that you this week, or is that DC?
Me. That's me. I'm Mr. Domestic, the domestic king. This house is my kingdom.
I actually picked up the nickname the Emperor while on the Gold Coast.
I think you just gave that to yourself.
No, I didn't actually.
Because they found out you're a filthy liar.
No,
because you wear no clothes.
Because you wear taking the joke.
I was wearing. I was known for walking around my apartment with nothing but a robe on, as well as also being the true owner of the land. So I was the Emperor. And I was expanding my territories.
I don't assume you gave yourself that nickname. All right, what's on the agenda?
The international story is the Hong Kong elections, which Dr. Xanax will be covering, I assume. And so, for those who are...
This has been a geopolitical masterclass, the last few raps on the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, I'm going to try and keep the Hong Kong story pretty brief, but it's going to be good because...
It's going to give you a brief.
I don't know where my brief's doing
and it's going to be brief.
It ain't brief down there, I'll tell you that.
I want to say something about how long you last, but I can't quite put it together. Too many nanganators.
Beach pathologist.
Yeah, but for those who are familiar with the show, you know we don't just jump in there. We've got a section called Jump Into Conclusions, where we pay homage to the wives and the girlfriends who jump to conclusions about their boyfriends or significant others without any real logic or any real evidence. Dr. Zan.
With the rise of the internet, there's no real need to go to school anymore.
Okay.
All right, that's something.
Something.
It's really something to sink your teeth into.
You know what? It's a safe meal. It's a safe meal. You won't get eliminated this week. You didn't try anything, though. You didn't risk anything.
Taste. Texture. Oh, 1,000 taste buds.
Where's that from?
That's I think that's H3H3 Productions.
I made mine up as well, but that's what I think that's on the cooking shows.
Yeah, definitely one of them MasterChef, one of them underpaying the workers type of shows.
My jumping conclusion is that the most lethal martial art in the world is Krav Maga.
It's like those memes where it's like I'm like 6'4", 150 kilos, jacked. I'm gonna smack you, and it's the skinny guy comes out with a gun. He's like, yeah. You know them memes? You know them memes?
Do you know those memes?
No, I assume they were
like
running around the Minecraft server or something.
Millennials.
Whatever
say that to the Glock.
Oh, right.
Oh, here we go. All
Whatever.
Right, well,
all right.
What do you say when you eat a Tide Pod?
That's when you say and you've been hanging around other Tide Pod analysts for a week in a different state.
When you run a whole city full of Tide Pod analysts. My one is that if you're thinking about going to the Gold Coast, go to Byron instead.
For schoolies?
Well, just in general. Just in general.
Okay, well, Andy's been hot off the mark with his schoolies stories before the rap. I'm keen to hear Andy continue
I want to
through the
smack
rap.
Alex on the internet.
Oh, that one's full. This rap's going to continue with a short intermission while we change the sim card.
Give us with some technical difficulties.
We also show you some videos of the
graphic
drop,
of the CHP merchandise in the interim. But Andy, you continue. Just ramble on a little bit while I change the thing.
So,
or do we want to just dive straight into the international?
no, we need to choose. I want you to do yours, Ian. Your internet one.
I'm much more keen. I think the viewers and the listeners would be much more keen to hear about how your personal experience on schoolies landed you to the conclusion that you're better off going to Byron.
I'm too sick to
especially
talk about
since about all the garbage you've spoken about people who live in Byron over the past couple of years.
I have never been to Byron.
You need a come to Jesus moment / a bit of repenting to do.
I've never been to Byron, so this is going to be interesting.
Look, the consumers don't want to hear Andy wussing out.
don't.
What they want to hear is Andy stepping up to the plate and smacking that ball out that Botany Park.
That Botany Park? What does that mean?
Byron Bay Park, sorry.
Yeah, you don't know what the bloody hell you're talking about, as per usual on the show.
Alright, we're back on. Does that look like a good angle?
That might have been the worst intermission known to man. That little one there. It's not straight, Dukes.
Just like you, bro. Nothing like a bit
Sick,
of casual
bro.
homophobia to spice up the rap.
Well, you know, when they look back at this episode in 20 years' time, they'll get you, Dougal.
I'll be rich by then.
Alright, we're back.
We're back on.
We're back. We would have started there with the international story, but just we don't like to break tradition around here. We've got customs for a reason, and so instead we go to. I assume that I have to ramble on about Gold Coast and Byron Bay as the conclusion.
Well, that's your conclusion. You got to jump to it, bruv. Alright, so domestic story. We're talking about the WESTPAC scandal. So this past week, AUSTRAC, which is an Australian government agency that, this is according to their website, uses financial intelligence and regulation to disrupt money laundering, terrorism financing, and other serious crime. Sorry, terrorism financing. Financing is not a crime. Now, AUSTRAC revealed that WESTPAC had breached anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism and finance laws 23 million times for $11 billion worth of transactions, including several involving child abuse, which was kind of the real kicker to the story, which got them in a lot of trouble.
If the terrorism wasn't enough?
They weren't really involved in funding terrorism. They were involved in kind of lending to banks in a range of questionable countries which might have funded terrorism, and they had kind of more. Anyway, that's a bit more complicated, a bit more up in the air. None of that's kind of proven, and the public didn't really care about that as much as they cared about the Philippines incident with the kind of child abuse, child trafficking, etc. We're going to focus on that today. Now, this forced the resignation of the Westpac head honcho, Brian Hartzer, along with the chairman, Lindsay Maxted. Now, most of the transactions which are in question relate to the failure to file reports about international funds transfers. Where are you going, Dos?
I need to get a drink of water. I'm sick.
Relate to that's the host leaving. If anyone's wondering.
First bit of bad news about the banks at Andy's.
Okay, so the transactions in question relate to the WESTPAC's failure to file reports about international funds transfers. And Austrac's most shocking allegation relates to thousands of transactions with the Philippines that fit a pattern consistent with child exploitation that the bank did not detect or block. Now, there's a lot of news articles which have copied and pasted this term, consistent with child sex trafficking funding or financing, and basically all they mean is a series of low value transactions going to the Philippines for no apparent reason, right? And they just failed to pick that up, particularly when some of the transactions, so for example, one of the transactions was going to a guy who had been convicted of child sex trafficking and live streaming child sex videos, trigger warning. But I don't think you're supposed to give trigger warning after you say it.
Yeah, I was going to say that,
but and then also there was a convicted pedophile who was then also was convicted on child sex trafficking offences, who was then sending money to the Philippines, and WESTPAC it didn't come up in, or WESTPAC didn't detect it or didn't block it or what have you. Now, WESTPAC have said that it was a bungled IT update in 2011, which meant that certain payments known as international funds transfers instructions or IFTIs with a number of banks weren't automatically being reported to AUSTRAC as legally required. Now, the problem with this explanation is that it then went for 6 to 7 years, and they only fixed that bug in 2018, right? And so this is where WESTPAC acquired all these 23 million bad transactions, 23 million kind of illegal transactions in up to $11 billion worth of money. And WESTPAC had racked up a theoretical, listen to this, $40 trillion penalty for their financial misdemeanors, let's say, because every IFTI that is not reported to AUSTRAC attracts a fine of up to 21 million. So anyway, there's a few little intricacies to that, but the overall problem was that WESTPAC did not comply with the regulation that they had to kind of oversee their the financial workings of their customers, and also some extra points to note before I throw to the other guys. There is more to this story after, which I'll expand on, but last year the rival Big Four bank Commonwealth agreed to pay AUSTRAC $700 million to settle a similar action against it, in which the regulator AUSTRAC alleged more than 53,000 breaches of anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism, finance laws. Okay, so Andy, Alex, headline reactions. Might throw it to Andos. He doesn't usually get the first reaction.
I don't really know what to think of this. I'm not sure, just because of like all the bureaucracy that comes with banking, just like in many other sectors, with the amount of just bigness that it has. I'm not really sure.
Size, the word
size, yeah. I'm not really sure what to think of it, and obviously at best case it's just like not knowing. At worst case it's a lot more serious and something that we should definitely be condemning either way.
Alex?
But yeah, I don't really know what to think of it.
Oh, a couple of things. The first thing is that they won't pay the full penalty. They won't pay anywhere near it. They'll probably pay about $1 billion, give or take.
That's what, yeah.
It'll be consistent with what the CBA paid, basically. There won't be any real damage to shareholders. It'll be a slight downtick, and then people will buy again, and then it'll jump back up.
How much is Australia's debt? Do you know? Do you know how much it is?
I'm not sure.
Anyway, 700 mil or $1 billion is quite a lot of money.
Not for Westpac. No, the problem is that these banks are so big now that they've been deemed...
I think they have profits of about 6 or 7 bill a year.
Yeah, sure. And they've been deemed systematically important banks, particularly for Australia. The big four banks constitute basically, anywhere between 30 and 40%, sometimes more, of the ASX, basically. And they're also deemed too big to fail. And this is basically the crux of the problem, is that these banks will actually spend a couple $100 million a year on compliance. Okay.
I will talk about that. Now, why don't you hold that thought?
Okay.
Because a guy called Andrew Bushnell, I think you say it, maybe it's Bushnell, he works at the Institute of Public Affairs, IPA, out of Melbourne. He wrote an article which was published in Sydney Morning Herald called "More Regulation is Not the Solution to WESTPAC Revelations." Alex, I think you'll like a lot of what he has to say.
I like it already.
I'm going to read you some of it, okay? He said...
Just a little quick bait there from
wrote,
Bushnell.
I've invited this guy on the podcast as well. I've sent him an email. Hopefully he replies. If you know him, then send him a message. He said, banks are already under the weight of substantial regulatory burden. Apart from the various civil and criminal laws to which they are subject, the Institute of Public Affairs research has shown that banks and the finance industry are governed by 76,000 pages of regulatory dark matter, referring to legislative instruments and bureaucratic guidance. An earlier report by Deloitte found that 1 in 11 Australian workers is employed in compliance, with the number in finance estimated to be even higher. Australia's banking industry does not suffer a lack of rules. To begin to answer the question of what to do, note first that the big banks and big business generally welcome regulations and actively cooperate in its creation. For big businesses, it is well understood that compliance can be useful for limiting competition from smaller rivals that are less able to bear the associated costs. They have little incentive then to adopt an adversarial approach to regulators. Now, if you remember, back in one of the real early raps, we gave, in particular, Dougal, gave a great analogy of this same concept with the drug cartels. People think the drug cartels, the big Pablo Escobars, are actually, at war with the CIA and FBI. And there is an extent of truth to that, but it's actually the FBI and the CIA, if you assume that even they are still at war, who keep Pablo Escobar in business, right? So let's say that demand for drugs isn't going to stop, right? Demand for drugs is going to be there regardless of, and there's going to be, a different willingness to pay, but there's always going to be demand for drugs at kind of whatever price. And then you say, well, what does the FBI and CIA trying to interfere in that do? Well, it just drives up the cost of supply. And what that means is that if you are kind of a small-scale drug dealer, it's going to be impossible for you to smuggle your drugs into America or wherever the FBI, CIA is operating. Now, some people would say because that's because the FBI is doing it themselves. But other people would say, if you believe the kind of what's happening, it's actually if you need several $1 million submarine to smuggle drugs into America, the only people that can do it are the Pablo Escobars. So by wiping out all the small-scale drug people, you're actually keeping in business all the large-scale drug people. Okay, now Alex is going to go do that USB. Yeah, use the one in that hand there. Yeah, because our ones are a bit out of juice. Or actually, you could just delete some of the old footage on that camera there, if you want. That'd be easier. So anyway, what he's saying in this case is that the big banks, because they can actually afford to have, 1 in 10% of their staff work in compliance and pay for really expensive legal counsel and regulatory guidance from the government, they're the people that are going to stay in the game. You're not going to get an independent bank or a small-scale bank who can start up and actually give consumers a better product. You can't have that competition with the creative destruction come and replace the legacy banks because they just can't afford to operate under the compliance conditions. So if we continue to read from his article, he says, in the case of banking, the most obvious self-interest is the perpetuation of Australia's anti-competitive cartelisation of the industry. Now, what cartel means in economics and finance is when several businesses who have a strong market share in an industry come together and say, look, we can actually charge, as long as we all agree and we all get in on this deal, we can charge higher prices to consumers. And it's a bit of game theory where if one person breaks that cycle, then the kind of cartel falls apart. But so long as the cartels all agree, all the players in the cartel agree to charge a high price, they all just make way bigger margins above their cost price. And the only way they can do that is through the regulatory environment such that no new competition can come up to challenge them or replace them through giving a better product to consumers. So just to finish off some of the highlights, He says, the banking industry then has been deliberately constructed by government, its practitioners and investors to prefer regulation and stability to competition and dynamism. Any policy that should target this any policy response should target this insularity by instilling some competitive discipline into the industry. The alternative is more regulation and more compliance costs. But if the root cause of Australia's banking problems is that the banks, regulators, the government, the lobby groups, and so on, are all in it together, then further regulation should be seen for what it is, the ruling class closing ranks. Now, before I throw it to Alex, who's kind of going along this same path before I read it out, we'll give a quick shout out again to Andrew Bushnell for his article in the SMH, More Regulation is Not the Solution to WESTPAC Revelations. I would also highlight that just a couple of banks, ING and Suncorp, are two mid-sized banks that are options away from the big four. And one of the other problems in the banking industry is that smaller banks are often linked to the big four, right? So Westpac owns St. George, Bank of Melbourne, Bank South Australia, Commonwealth Bank owns Bank West, NAB owns UBank. And so it creates a false perception that there's a lot of options in the industry. But if you're looking for a mid-sized bank where your money's going to be safe, that are alternatives from the big four, you can have a look at Suncorp and ING. Alex, what are you thinking?
I think Bushnell makes basically the correct point, and he's right. What I think a deeper thing is, so you had a situation where between 2011 and 2018, is my understanding, Westpac is basically running up these charges that go through the gate. So you've got a situation in which we're paying these regulators all this money to essentially look out for these type of things, and it's 7 years later, and it finally comes to light that they've kind of amassed 23 million breaches.
And
okay,
CommBank had this very similar thing last year.
CommBank did the same. So what's absolutely apparent is, even if we assume arguendo and we say that Westpac actually just didn't really realise, and that it was an IT issue. The fact is that the regulators can't regulate. First thing, so that the only thing that can really regulate these is going to be the market, because it's obviously that the regulators can't cope with existing regulations, let alone with new regulations, and that the only thing that the banks love more than profits is basically new regulations. The problem is you've also got a situation with the banks are already spending hundreds of $millions each year on compliance, and they're still not compliant. Okay, so you've got a situation where the regulators can't regulate, the banks are trying to be compliant. Let's assume that they're trying to be compliant and they're not being compliant. Basically, the people who lose out are the customers and the ordinary citizens. So I would say that the answer is fairly clear. It's exactly what Mr. Bushnell has described. It's to deregulate the banks, if anything, open up more options for finance, and we should also stop giving money to these agencies who are supposed to be regulating.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like what they're paying for when they're paying 10% of their staff for compliance is actually it's not paying for compliance. It's paying to prevent competition entering the industry.
But I would also say that basically, if Westpac are able to amass 23 million transactions and go for 7 years without being found out, I just don't think you would actually have to look very hard into a bank, into the transactions, to actually find breaches of regulations as it is. So there's almost, I would say that there's an element of compliance, or at least an element of a relationship here between the regulators and the banks, which would suggest that the regulators are under the understanding that what we'll do is every now and then we'll just go in and have a look at a bank. We'll find something, we'll slap them with a fine. Last year was CBA, this year it's Westpac. Next year it'll probably be ANZ, and it'll just go kind of round the roulette. And the problem, like, why are we paying for this garbage? Why are we paying for it?
Yeah, well, we're paying for it because, what was it, some big four pillars approach, which is one of the things Bushnell refers to in the article. I don't know, it's like an economic policy which is saying the big four banks should be like the pillars of our finance system, but it doesn't make a lot of sense, because we're paying for fees for not me in particular,
paying for fees for no service.
Paying for fees for no service.
Dead people are getting charged fees.
Dead people are getting charged fees. You are paying for agencies to regulate them who are not only not regulating, who are regulating them, but the banks aren't following them. But then you're also paying for you're paying the salaries of those regulators, then you're also paying the compliance salaries of those people at those banks. And then you're also paying for the extra margin between the cost price and the sales price of the cartel. So you're paying all of these extra premiums that you wouldn't need to pay if there wasn't regulation in the first place. Not to mention the fact that the products would have actually been improved if there was regulation through a competitive environment in the alternative scenario.
I would say that the only last thing I would say is that it's important now to draw the distinction between being pro-business and pro-market. So there is actually a fundamental distinction, and one of the distinctions is being pro-market or being kind of an economic conservative or more towards libertarian doesn't mean that you support the business. You support business in everything that it does. What you support is the right of that business to compete against all the other businesses on a supply-demand basis. What you don't support is through governmental levers, businesses being able to gain an artificial advantage over other businesses, not on a basis of providing a good or a service at a better price or better quality, but just on the fact that they're so big and they're a big business that they can actually weather the cost.
Now, here's one last point. This might take us on a bit of a tangent, but I'd like to...
We are getting tangential. Watch out for the soundboard. Should be coming next week.
Getting tangential is... So, presumably, what Austrac would have wanted Westpac to do was flag these transactions and probably close the bank account of the people involved in, particularly the child sex trafficking ring, right? So... If you say, well, okay, they don't get access to financial services, pedophiles, they're out of there, right? Recently, in the past few months, we've seen, I think, Blair Cottrell's bank account get shut down. We saw Sargon Abakard's Patreon get shut down probably a year ago, which has created the buzz around the ThinkSpot platform and a kind of exodus from Patreon from a range of well-known people. As just a general point, what should the line be between... where people should be denied access to a bank account or financial services?
I would say that a business or a bank is more than entitled to deny access to whoever they want, basically. In the same way that I think that I should, if I own a business, be able to hire whoever I want and provide services to whoever I want. I don't think that just because the banks have acted in a manner that's inconsistent with what we think is okay, that we should then say that the banks can't do that. Banks can do whatever they want, and it's actually when they act in a particular way and start discriminating against, assuming that the market operates on fair market principles, that you'll actually see a movement away or new opportunities and that dynamism kind of spur forth. So I'm no qualms about it.
Okay, how about... Oh, Endos, do you want to take over?
Well, very, very good job there, Dukes. I really actually appreciated that analysis this week.
That's good. I've been bringing very strong analysis the past 2 weeks, in particular, because this is our premiere show, The Wrap.
So you best keep that in mind. It's our goddamn premiere show. But moving on to the international story, which is the Hong Kong elections. Dr. Xanax, take it away.
Yeah, so we'll cover this quickly because Hong Kong's basically been the story everyone's been talking about. And in fairness, we haven't really spoken about it that much besides the one episode.
Andy and I did one.
Yeah, we did.
Well.
We did wax lyrical about it, I would say.
We did. So we've done 2 Hong Kong stories.
And obviously, this one's probably Dougal will definitely know more about this story than I do. And I'll leave it open to Dukes as a kind of a softball story that he can take a smack at, and then
here we go.
We can see if he can
some last minute delegation.
No. I'll say because last week when we covered another China story,
we were right. Let's give a quick shout out. We gave the best summation of that China spy story out of anyone in the Australian media. Firstly, because we actually looked at the facts of what the spy was alleging, and then we also looked at the China story, what China was saying happened. We looked at the statements from Chinese-owned newspapers, and then we also looked at statements about Xinjiang papers from the Beijing embassy in London. We didn't see anyone else doing that in the Australian media, and we came to the conclusion that he had some interesting insights, but we were largely sceptical. Now, Alex was slightly more sceptical than I was, but we were then proven right in the subsequent days. We were actually proven exactly right that he seems to be a fringe level spy
at best.
And fraud cop-out at worst.
And every single journalist at Fairfax who covered the story, particularly these alleged analysts and editors who decided that they were going to put their 2 cents in really and say that this is basically the biggest thing since the Petrov scandal.
Who said that? Who's that guy? AFR guy. Senior editor.
There was a bunch of them. There was a bunch of them at the AFR. Now the AFR is supposed to be the Australian Financial Review, but it's just basically
propaganda.
Well, it's basically the Sydney Morning Herald with the occasional economics update from the RBA. That's basically what it is. And when they got found out, and absolutely, so there were a couple of guys who wrote pieces about 3 days ago, and then it subsequently came out that at best this guy was a fringe analyst. But we had been saying that. We said that it looks like it was going to be that way a week earlier.
Or if you want to also see me call Mike Smith, the Shanghai correspondent, the B word, you can tune in and find it and tell us a timestamp.
Well, he absolutely deserved a touch-up.
We'll chuck that in the soundboard as well, calling someone the B word.
Yeah. That'll be a good...
You're straight up bitch.
Okay, so... on the 24th of November, Hong Kong held some local district elections, and the pro-democracy camp, so the democracy, the candidates which aligned themselves with the plight of the protesters, won 392 out of 452 seats, taking control of 17 out of 18 district councils. So not only that, the November 24 elections had actually the highest number of registered voters ever for these Hong Kong local elections, registering around 70%. So for what I assume are optional elections, basically, which is what really, elections should be, I think, is optional, 70% turnout. It was also the greatest number of pro-democracy candidates ever to unite and run together on a commonly agreed platform, this person who wrote this article said turning the election into a referendum on the protest movement. They called themselves the Democratic Coalition for the District Council's election, and their platform endorsed the 5 demands of the 5-month-old youth-driven insurgency. So, one of those demands has obviously already been achieved, which is kind of the taking off the table of the extradition bill. The 3 others are protest-related. The 5th relating to the way that the protesters have been treated, etc. And the 5th is a resumption of the Hong Kong's electoral reform project abandoned in 2014-2015. So basically, in 2014, Beijing said, so the China position was that it would allow direct election of the chief executive, but only from a list of pre-approved candidates. So that was since dropped. And however, that was perhaps the first in recent memory of mass protests. Did you want to jump in? No? So although the councillors' powers are limited, so these are the people who have been elected, so it's given that bloc a bigger say in the selection process for the chief executive, so the kind of Prime Minister, President...
Carrie Lam equivalent.
Yeah. So by handing them control of 117 seats on the 1,200-member committee that chooses the chief executive. So that's basically the immediate outcome, is that they've got a bigger jump in kind of the power to select, I guess, a pro-democracy.
Say that again. What do they have?
So they've got... handed them control of...
Who handed them? Can you just repeat the last kind of 3 sentences?
Although councillors' powers are limited, the victory will give the bloc a bigger say in the selection process for the chief executive, so president equivalent, by handing them control of 117 seats on the 1,200-member committee that chooses the chief executive. So there's 2 kind of chambers to the Hong Kong legislative process. There's the chief executive, and then there's also the legislative bloc, which are two separate things. Dukes, headline reaction: does the election of these councillors reflect the broader consensus, do you think, within Hong Kong and kind of the will, I guess, of the Hong Kong people?
Yeah, sure. I think it does. I'd be interested to see exactly if all the seats were kind of up for grabs and kind of where they are geographically. I think the support for the democracy protests tends to be really particularly strong in the centre of the city of Hong Kong. And once you get to the outskirts, when it's just people doing business, it's just your everyday person. You're not really surrounded by universities or in the metropolitan areas. People don't really care. They want to do business, and that's why you see. There's definitely an aspect of government relationships between when the people, the triads or whoever it was, went and beat up some of the protesters. They were protesting out in kind of the suburbs, and people in the suburbs didn't want to be affected by the protests. People in the suburbs mainly wanted to do business. I'm told from my Hong Kong friends, and so although there was definitely government involvement in it, the idea that people were very angry at protesters when they wanted to come out and paralyse the outskirts of the suburbs after having paralysed the inner city area is true. That they didn't want that to happen, right? But I think it is interesting that it got such a big majority, because when people say the US, these congressional by-elections or special elections or whatever they are, a kind of referendum on Trump, it's like, well, what does that really mean? Like, Trump is almost like this abstract idea that they're trying to just paint as racist or sexist or a kind of bumbling buffoon, but the effect's not really right in front of you. So to say it's a referendum on Trump it's an abstract at best. But when you're in Hong Kong and it's like, well, this is a referendum on the protests, it's like, you see these protests every weekend. You see students locked up in a university. You see archers firing at police from inside. You see students sliding down ropes out of secret passageways and then getting on their friends' bikes, who are picking them up and driving them home, all in black masks so that they can't get identified by police on kind of the getaway. It's a situation where Hong Kong, for the first time in a long time, is in recession. Every weekend, if you own a retail store that's anywhere close to the city, good luck selling anything. Good luck selling anything even during a normal afternoon when there's a few protesters out. Families don't want to go shopping when there's protests on. You have it affecting kind of every single aspect of your life in Hong Kong. And as far as an election can be a referendum on anything, I think this is about as true as that gets. And I think it's probably true that there's widespread support. That there's a lot of support for Hong Kong and the democracy movement. There's a lot of strong support, particularly from university students. It's also true that a lot of people don't really care. I don't know how many strong Chinese nationalists there are in Hong Kong, but probably they would probably be the third largest group out of the three, probably the smallest, from what I can tell. Also, an interesting piece of information has been that Donald Trump signed the human rights bill. We were going to get to that. All right, well, why don't we talk about that then?
Okay, did you want to jump in just quickly?
Well, I was just thinking, with that 30% that didn't vote, and if Dougal's geopolitical analysis of Hong Kong is right, I feel as if it'd be not safe to say, but an idea that the remaining 30% would probably be less sympathising to the protesters if they're sort of away from the university, sort of away from the political debate, and on the outskirts where they just care about their business. I feel as if it would be interesting to see what that 30% would chuck up. But I pretty much agree with Dougal's analysis there. It's very, very well done.
So basically, straight afterwards, hundreds of, or almost occurring simultaneously, hundreds of people gathered at Charter Garden on Sunday afternoon. So in Hong Kong, to thank President Trump, so Donald Trump, for signing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that could lead to diplomatic and economic sanctions on the city. Last week, Trump signed into law the legislation that could impose diplomatic and economic sanctions against Hong Kong, much to the anger of China, which said it constituted meddling in the country's internal affairs, as it warned that it would result in consequences. The law, among other things, will allow Washington to suspend Hong Kong's special trading status based on an annual certification by the State Department, which will gauge whether the city retains a sufficient degree of autonomy under the one country, two systems framework. So as you can imagine, Beijing was not super stoked about that. Beijing has suspended the review of requests by US military ships and aircraft to visit the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region in response to a Hong Kong-related legislation passed by the US lawmakers, said Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying. Dukes, headline reaction, good Trump, bad Trump.
Yeah, I really don't know. It's very, so far as a country is governed by its borders and international rules and regulations, this absolutely is meddling in another country's domestic politics. But we do have a tendency to meddle in other countries' domestic politics, and then we are usually just discussing whether it's justified or not. And in a range of cases it is, in a range of cases it's not. And we tend not to hold national sovereignty that high on our list of priorities. I think there's definitely a big natural sympathy with everybody in Hong Kong, which I deeply share, which is they want the same stuff that we have, right? Which we find are important. They want democracy, freedom of speech. We kind of have this, not as much as Americans, but we're always kind of skeptical that there's a big evil government that might come and try and get us. And, it's almost like there's a range of people who fear in Australia that China's really big and powerful. They might come for us. And it's almost like Hong Kong is just like a version of Australia, which is closer to China. A lot of Australians have been to Hong Kong. We've both kind of been under, the British monarchy for extended periods of time together. And so a lot of people are really naturally supportive of Hong Kong, which I share, but at the same time, I also see that it was given back to China. Historically, it was part of China. It was acquired under very, very questionable, if not immoral, circumstances after the Opium Wars. But you just have now a situation where the two peoples are not really the same anymore. The two peoples are not the same, but kind of everything else is. And so far as people's sentiments or people's thoughts or people's ideologies or people's personal individual identities might constitute a culture and a culture might constitute a nation, well, then you would say Hong Kong is very different from China. But so far as international borders and governments and international treaties and laws constitute what a country is, then Hong Kong is absolutely part of China. You then also have the culture in China, which is like we've been smashed by other countries for 200 years, and we've had our lands taken over. We've been made very poor, which is the internal narrative, which has large elements of truth in it in China, although some elements of obfuscation of truth and omission and some lies to it. But that narrative of victimization definitely has some elements of truth in it. And one of those elements of victimization is that we had this awesome city, Hong Kong, which was taken away from us, and now it's time for Hong Kong to come back. I mean, if you look at Beijing's kind of most recent blockbuster film, which was sponsored by the Chinese government, called My People, My Country. It plays in Burwood. I don't think it plays in anywhere else. It tells a series of stories about from founding of New China in 1949 to recently, and it's kind of like a super nationalistic propaganda film. One of the stories is like Hong Kong reunification, and basically the story tells the guy who's running the it tells the story of the guy who's running the ceremony where Hong Kong is handed back from the British to the Chinese in 1997, and it connects the story of him, who's the event organizer with a watchmaker in Hong Kong, and basically the story kind of runs like the organizer gets the best watchmaker to make him a watch, and the British event organizer a watch, because they have to work together so that both their watches are on the exactly the right time, and so that the flag for China gets raised at exactly midnight, not 1 second before, not 1 second after, on whatever night it was. And they said, Hong Kong must return home to China with not 1 second late or something like that. You know, we can't spare 1 second that Hong Kong is not part of China anymore. And that's what the Chinese feel. So I kind of see both sides. And China feels hard done by. The Hong Kong people feel hard done by. It's not an easy problem to solve by any means. It is meddling. Is the meddling justified? Maybe. That's my take.
Andy, what's your hot take?
I think I'm quite similar to Dukes. I think I probably sympathise more with the Hong Kongese people than I do the Chinese government. But yeah, really, I'm unsure. I'm not really sure how this is going to play out. What resolution is going to come to. So. I'm quite similar to Dougal in we're just sort of in a bit of limbo at the moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to say bad Trump, to be honest. I don't really like meddling. I don't think. I mean, I think it's difficult to make a case in which you can put the rights and of sovereignty of a people to make their own decisions above your own kind of version of morality, particularly when I don't think you can actually say that there's no immediate threat to your own people.
But I mean,
present.
The people, if we're taking the results of this election in hand, the people aren't making the decision. It's a government which isn't representative of the people.
Well, sure, but China wouldn't say that.
But
we say that.
Well,
and I think it's true, but
the problem is that when you operate on a level of borders and sovereignty is kind of a definable, tangible thing. When you operate on the level of abstraction and moral principles and even to democracy to an extent, you're necessarily superimposing your own version of morality on a different people. And I say the first priority is basically let other people sort out their own problems, particularly states, because it's very difficult, for example, for us to say, well, Donald Trump should be meddling in, say, Hong Kong, but not, for example, Venezuela or something like that.
That's true.
But they does meddle. They have heavy sanctions on Venezuela.
Yeah.
So there is meddling in that sense.
There is.
I mean, even still though, like if it's moral, if we come to the conclusion that it is morally justifiable to do it in this one case, as well as in many other cases, then it's not like condemnable to do it in that one place.
Yeah, look, I think it's difficult to tell, but if I was going to put my foot on either side of the camp, is it good Trump, bad Trump? I'd probably say bad Trump.
Yeah,
and I know that will anger a particular
probably the majority
of. It could be even the majority of our listeners, and especially I know that it'll anger one alternative media personality in particular, Tim Wilms. From the Unshackled, who's been very good to us, and who I think
the 6'11" Tim Wilms.
He's normally right, but I think there is a bit of a schism between CHP potentially and the Unshackled on the China issue.
Drama in the Australian alt-right media.
I think there's room for healthy discussion.
And I'd be. We're not really alt-right, Dossie.
Yeah. Sort of bit my tongue after saying it a little bit.
Well, you should have bit your tongue beforehand because now you've given the trolls something to work with. Okay,
Yeah,
well look, I'm happy to wrap that up. Yeah. I think that's okay. I mean, a lot of people talk about Hong Kong. My fear is that when people, I think someone used to say that when all sides of politics agree on something, normally an extra big effing's coming your way.
I would also say that while I'm sceptical of it, if I was born and raised in Hong Kong, I would probably be in the protests. I'd probably participate.
You would be protesting if Ling's fast food shop raised their prices by 20%.
I just think that I kind of support the Chinese government way of pursuing their interests, but I kind of also support the Hong Kong students pursuing their own interests.
For sure. I just think there's a lack of awareness or illumination regarding the Chinese perspective.
Yeah, no, sure. But I also think, so I think you can be critical of foreign state intervention without being necessarily critical of the protesters themselves. Like, I think you could say that, basically anyone in Australia, if they lived in Hong Kong, would probably be like, yeah, I'd go join the protest, blah, blah, blah.
For sure. For sure. I think you can definitely uphold the individual's right to protest and to kind of pursue his own, go after the pursuit of happiness.
I'm kind of being impressed with the whole. You can't talk when I'm away from the mic.
The level of organisation.
Yeah, the level of organisation and the persistence. You know, and they're not really scared of the Chinese government. Even when the Chinese government was loading troops up on the border at Shenzhen, and they've had troops there for a long time, the protesters still seem to be going, and you know they haven't lost faith.
But can you see Hong Kong protesters versus Antifa? That would be a matchup for sure. I reckon those Antifa.
Depends if 6-7 man buns on Antifa team or not.
So I'll tell you what, if I see 6-7 man bun out there again, he's getting a left right good night.
See, that's going to get us sued. That's going to get us sued.
You reckon he would cop a 3-piece combo before you cop a
He'd cop a 1-2 Mayweather, then a 3-4 McGregor.
Andy, I think he'd probably throw you over the balcony.
I reckon there's a good chance he would make you a little pretzel.
You know what, 6-7 man bun and the Victorian socialists that are listening out there and trying to add me on Facebook, you don't want this smoke. You don't want this smoke.
You should have accepted them. All right, we're going to wrap this up by going back to...
Jumping to conclusions. For those who have seen the show, you know we don't leave things untied. And I won this week. I got the chance to prove my point this week. I haven't won yet, and I probably won't win, but that's okay. My conclusion was that if you're thinking about going to the Gold Coast, go to Byron Bay instead. Now, this is not limited to schoolies. This is...
Good clarification.
This is just in general. I think if you're going to Gold Coast, there's a few things that you're going there for, right? I'd say first and foremost, you're going for the beach and the weather, right? I would say that's fair.
Sure. It's a holiday destination.
It's a holiday destination. And with that holiday destination, the second thing that you're probably going there for is the nightlife, right?
Or theme parks, Wet and Wild.
Theme parks, they're pretty good. I didn't take those into account, but...
Continue. Ian's first cracks in the conclusion are becoming apparent.
I didn't really think this one through very much, but...
Keep going, I'm interested to hear it.
I think that you can get those things, except for theme parks, in Byron Bay without the grubbiness of the Gold Coast. I know that I'm probably skewed too far anti-Gold Coast.
Particularly since you've probably had a lot of family holidays there that's been fully paid for and very enjoyable by any holiday standard. Has given you bias against the Gold Coast.
Let him finish it. Let him make
after being
the point he has.
After being and becoming part of the scrub of degenerates that have been up there, I've been a little bit scarred, and I feel as if, the reports I've also received from Byron this week have been very good in that you get all they're not very far away. It's an hour and a half bus trip from Gold Coast to Byron, right?
You get an hour and a half in the car.
It's, you know
what about
Does any bus trip become a measurement for how far something away is?
Because that's how people got in between during the week.
Is that in light years? You got a light years measurement, or?
Well, the report is that Byron Bay, of course, it's got pretty much the exact same weather, and it's a little bit more low key, and in that you don't get all the hustle and bustle, and the grubbiness of the Gold Coast, while still getting.
Can you define grubbiness for the listeners?
Well, I mean, if you take a stroll up Cavill Avenue, which
like
is quite...
Cameron Smith? You saw Cameron Smith
Cameron's just a little bit of Greg Bird up there. On Gold Coast Titans, Greg Bird. But you walk up Cavill Avenue, during the day it's really nice, right? But when it starts, when the sun goes down over the horizon, then it comes a new town. It's not a bad...
bedroom.
It's a town for bad men is what it is.
And Andy, okay, I reckon I've heard enough of this. Andy, let me give you a quick geography lesson because you haven't studied it before. What you're talking about is surfers paradise. Okay, there's a difference between surfers paradise and the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is a strip, quite a large strip,
surfers paradise. You said the Gold Coast is a strip.
Yeah, it is a strip. It is a strip, and it's much larger than surfers paradise. In fact, surfers paradise is to the Gold Coast what Parramatta is to Greater Western Sydney. It is one
Hollywood Boulevard is to California.
Exactly right. So Andy needs a lesson in geography first, number one, because there are a whole bunch of, if you go to
And we have some of our best listeners live in the Gold Coast.
There are many different faces of the Gold Coast, and Andy's slagging off the entirety on the basis of his 1 week in surfers with a bunch of his degenerate
Nanginator mates
and Tide Pod analyst does not a good analysis make.
I'm not sure why you let me do this conclusion. This is why
I need to get one. Keep talking. I'm going to get one thing.
This is why I was loving.
It's Dougal's bringing props.
I was loving so hard for.
You can go to plenty of different places on the Gold Coast which will not bring you the grubbiness.
I went to Burleigh, which was really nice actually.
Yeah, was it different to surfers?
Well, it was different to
surfers. Okay, well, you just proved my point. Disproved yours in one sentence.
Well, today I was doing some Chinese study for a test coming up, and Chinese has these like 4-character idioms. I'm going to read you one. It's 盲人摸象. Now, our Chinese audience would know what that is. What it directly
think so.
What it directly translates to is blind people touching an elephant. And the backstory is that a long time ago there was a very wise king who sent out some army members to get him 2 things. 1, get me a big elephant, and 2, get me some people who were blind from birth, right? So the army people bring him a big elephant and bring him a group of people who are blind from birth. Now, these blind people obviously never seen an elephant before because they were blind, never touched an elephant, had no idea what the elephant was. So he says, go and touch. He says, this is an elephant, go and touch it, tell me what it feels like. And one of them touches the teeth and he says, this feels like something sharp. One of them touches the trunk and says, this feels like a rope. One of them touches the ears. He says, this feels like a fan. One of them touches the body. Says, this feels like something else. Anyway, they were all wrong because they were only touching one part of the elephant, and because they were blind, they couldn't see the full picture. What this idiom means is that you shouldn't make conclusions when you only have access to one part of the data. And Andy should not 盲人摸象. Which means Andy, as the blind man, should not make conclusions about the Gold Coast without having access to all the data.
And have you been to Byron before?
You know I haven't been to Byron before.
So not only has Andy only been to one part of the Gold Coast, he has not even been to Byron.
And you didn't take into account the best part of the Gold Coast, which is Wet and Wild.
Wet and Wild is overrated.
Where you control the action.
That's different.
Alrighty, is that it?
That's it.
I've lost so miserably this week. Can't jump to conclusions.
Fumbling and bumbling, Andy thought that he was coming in hot.
No,
with all
I did
this first-hand experience.
I knew that one sucked.
This is the problem with this this is one of the problems, I guess, with this new way of looking at things where personal experience trumps objective facts and reasoning. And it's definitely a Tide Pod analyst trait. It's definitely a trait that I think is particularly prevalent among Andy's socialist mates.
Socialist.
Look, I'm happy to jump on Andy for a poor conclusion, but Alex didn't offer much.
Getting rid of schools.
I wanted to slam you for that, and I would have slammed you. We all know it's easier to go on the offensive on jumping to conclusions rather than defensive.
Not for me.
I could have easily defended my position.
I already defended the best one of the season.
Okay, alright. That's going to wrap us up. Tell us what you think in the comments. Andy, do you want to do the housekeeping?
The housekeeping is, if you like this type of thing, a little bit sloppy today, I think. But you know what? Putting in that work, hour after hour.
It was some good analysis.
Very good analysis. Yeah, the actual analysis.
I think it's been some of our best
today.
analysis.
Also, we did a sick drop of merch. We should really be wearing it today. The reason why we're not wearing it is because we actually wear it so much. We actually had to wash it today. You can check that out, carnagehouseproductions.com, if you want to buy a t-shirt or a tank top. Patreon if you want to support us with donations. Check us out on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Andy's given us a report for how to start Twitch. So if you're interested in Carnage House Gaming, that's going to be coming soon.
Yeah, that's hard.
Sports and culture report, potentially, if Andy's onto it for the week coming up. Alex is writing an article on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to be writing an article. I'm going to be writing an article about Dougal's top 5 book recommendations for Christmas.
And get ready for the soundboard. It's on its way.
The soundboard's on its way.
Pew pew pew.
About 9 weeks in the planning.
Perfect.
Gotten tangential.
Oh.